On the night they served me cold roast and warm silence, my daughter leaned in and whispered, "Dad, don't speak tomorrow. Just let us handle it." It wasn't a request. It was a quiet exile dressed in politeness. 3 days before, my son had looked me in the eye and said, "You had your time. Now let the future take care of itself." But what he really meant was, "Step aside, quietly, before you make this harder." They were finalizing plans, and without me. The house, the money, the transition of responsibilities. It was a beautiful way of saying, "We want everything you built, but none of the man who built it." I didn't raise my voice, didn't throw the chair, didn't remind them of the decades I spent wiping their tears and covering their mistakes. I just watched, fork in hand, appetite gone, and a memory resurfaced, one I thought had been buried with my wife. Years ago at her funeral, I heard the same tone. "Dad, don't make this about you. Just stay quiet, okay?" I stayed quiet, even when they skipped her favorite hymn, even when they passed the microphone to everyone, except me. Now history came back in different clothes. They called it practical. They said I was too emotional to be part of the legal conversation. I didn't argue, because I knew silence, when used right, is louder than rage. That night, I went into my study, pulled out a file from the bottom drawer, labeled in faded ink, "Real Will with Mary's Notes." It had dust on it, but justice doesn't expire. They thought I'd just sit in the background, like a portrait on the wall, forgotten, silent, harmless. What they didn't know? Portraits can be replaced, but legacies, they speak. And mine was about to. Not through shouting, not through family dinners turned debates, but through the one person they feared more than me, my lawyer. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. If you're still with me, could you write in the comments where you're listening from? Have you ever faced something similar in your own family? That moment when silence felt like the only option? Your support means the world to us. If this story speaks to you, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep these stories alive. And now, let's continue. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Too quiet. I knew that kind of silence. It wasn't peace. It was planning. Voices began to rise behind the closed door of the dining room. I wasn't invited. I wasn't even acknowledged. Just a soft pat on the shoulder from my grandson as he passed me on the way in, as if I were a guest in my own home. I sat in the kitchen, the chair creaking beneath me with every slight movement, my coffee growing cold between my hands. But the walls, they remembered me. The home I built, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, sacrifice after sacrifice, it still knew my place, and the wall between the kitchen and dining room had always been thinner than they realized. I didn't want to listen, but how do you not hear voices discussing your life like it's an outdated policy? "He's getting slower. We can't wait forever. We'll just say it's for his own good. He'll understand eventually. But what if he pushes back?" "He won't. He never does. That's the thing. He's used to being quiet." I looked at the table in front of me, the same one where I once taught my son to write his name, where I once placed birthday cakes and folded love letters from Mary. Now that table in the next room was being used to erase me. Politely, strategically. They weren't planning a betrayal. They called it a transition. They used words like streamlining, family assets, efficiency. But I knew what it meant. They were redrawing the map, and I had become a smudge they intended to erase. What hurt most wasn't the greed. It was the ease. The way my name was spoken in the past tense. Dad used to handle that. He used to know the numbers. Back then, when he was sharper, I wasn't gone. I was sitting 20 feet away. But they'd already started mourning the version of me that once mattered to them. The voices grew louder, laughs, agreement, papers shuffling, and then the sentence that wrapped itself around my chest like wire. "He won't fight us. He doesn't have the energy anymore." They were right about one thing. I didn't have the energy to fight, but I didn't need energy. I had time, I had memory, and I had something they didn't, the truth. Not the loud kind that knocks over chairs, the quiet kind, the one that waits. They had their meeting, but they forgot. This house, every corner, every crack in the wood, it still belonged to me, and every betrayal has an echo. A few days later, my son came into my study. No knock, just a practiced smile and a folder in hand. His tone was light, but his eyes flickered with urgency. There was something rehearsed about the way he stepped over the threshold, like a salesman stepping into a client's office, not a son returning to his father's space. He placed the folder on my desk gently, like he was laying down a gift. "We've found a better arrangement," he said. "More modern, streamlined. Legal's all taken care of. Just needs your signature." I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I'd seen that kind of confidence before. The kind that only appears when someone thinks you're too weak to resist, too old to matter, too silent to stop them. He tapped the folder with 2 fingers, like sealing a deal with invisible ink, then turned and left the room. Just like that. No questions, no explanation, no warmth. I sat there for a long time before opening it. It was all there. Assets, properties, adjustments in language so carefully chosen it almost sounded generous. Almost, but I know how to read beyond words. My wife and I used to read between each other's silences. So this document wasn't streamlined. It was a surgical removal of me. They had rewritten the future without the hands that built it. My name wasn't gone. No, they were smarter than that. It was still there, but moved, lower, smaller, stripped of weight. They had turned me into a technicality in my own legacy. The words bled with detachment. To be managed by the next generation. Resources will be redistributed for efficiency. The original will has been rendered outdated by current needs. Current needs, as if the past had expired, as if the roof over their heads didn't come from 100 unpaid weekends, skipped vacations, sleepless nights when I worked 3 jobs and still came home smiling. I closed the folder slowly, feeling the weight of their decisions settle into my hands like dust that refused to be brushed away. And then I opened the bottom drawer. There it was. Yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but not forgotten. Our will, mine and Mary's, drawn up at the kitchen table in a different lifetime, with laughter and tears in equal measure, her handwriting in the margins. Notes like, "Make sure Anna gets the piano. She loved playing it when she was sad." Not strategy. Not leverage. Love. I placed their folder beside ours. One felt like stone, the other like sunlight trapped in paper. I didn't throw theirs away. I didn't shred it. No, I left it intact. Because someday they might need to look at it and see what they lost, trying to control what never truly belonged to them. I didn't sign. Not out of anger, but because love should never come with a pen and deadline. And as I closed the drawer, I whispered, not to the room, but to Mary, "They think silence is surrender, but it's just the pause before truth takes the stand." The day after the papers arrived, my daughter came to me with that careful expression, the kind people use when they speak to someone they think is fragile, breakable, too old to understand the full weight of what's happening. She sat beside me on the porch. We looked out at the same garden her mother used to tend, now overgrown but still holding echoes of laughter, teacups, and barefoot summer evenings. And with a soft voice, too soft, as if the truth might bruise me, she said, "Just stay quiet, Dad, for peace. It's better that way. For peace." I nodded, but only because I didn't want her to hear how deeply that sentence cut through me. They all said it now, in different ways, wrapped in different tones. It's not about you anymore. Don't make this harder. Let us lead. But what they meant was silence. Not the dignified kind, the kind used to erase. I spent years teaching them that peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the presence of respect. It was staying at the table when the conversation turned difficult. It was disagreeing and still holding each other's hands. It was looking your father in the eye and saying, "I hear you, even when you don't agree." But now peace had been rebranded. Now peace meant I was no longer welcome to speak, no longer needed at the table. Not in family matters, not in decisions, not in the legacy I helped carve from the dust. I watched them move through the house like I was already gone. They laughed more easily when I left the room. They spoke freely once my footsteps faded into the hallway. I became the ghost they waited for, silently, respectfully, conveniently. And so I learned a different kind of silence. Not the kind I gave willingly, but the kind that settled in the bones. Every time I looked at the family portrait, the one Mary insisted we take when I didn't want to smile, I saw now what I had missed. The cracks had already started forming back then. Smiles too wide, eyes looking elsewhere, a family that posed together, but had already begun pulling apart thread by thread. They said, "Just stay quiet," and so I did, not out of weakness, but to give them what they asked for. I stopped reminding them of the bills I paid, of the nights I stood guard when fever spiked, of the dreams I let go of so they could chase theirs. I let the silence fill the rooms they thought they owned, and I watched how fast they filled it, with greed, with convenience, with edits to the truth. But what they never understood was that real silence, the kind that comes after love is ignored, doesn't fade. It gathers. It waits. It sharpens. And when it finally speaks, it speaks louder than they're ready for. It had been a week of long silences and short conversations, a week of being spoken around instead of spoken to, the kind of week that makes a man question if the life he built was ever really his, or just something others used until they could redesign it. The house was quiet that morning, too quiet. I sat by the window, watching the light stretch across the old floorboards. Dust floated like memories in the sunbeams. I was holding one of Mary's scarves, faded lavender, still carried her scent. Faint, but real enough to bring her back for a moment. She always knew when storms were coming. And this silence, it wasn't peace. It was the air before a downpour. Then came the knock. Firm, steady, not family. I opened the door to a man in a dark suit. Not young, not old. Just the right kind of in-between to be dangerous. Sharp, polished, and sure of his purpose. He introduced himself, by name, then by occupation. A lawyer, representing someone I hadn't heard from in years. "Mr. Fraser," he said, and in an instant I was back in a dusty pickup truck beside my oldest friend. College roommates. Built our first businesses side by side. Lost touch after Mary got sick. Life pulls people apart in ways neither of you see until decades have passed. But now he had sent this man, with a plain envelope in hand. No stamp, no return address, just a deep crease down the middle, like it had been folded and unfolded more than once. He held it out, but didn't let go right away. Instead, he looked me in the eye and said 6 words that bent the floor beneath my feet. "Your name is still the first." I didn't open the envelope immediately. Instead, I felt the world shift, not with noise, but with clarity, because after weeks of being erased, replaced, rewritten, someone had remembered. Someone had chosen to preserve the truth, not revise it, not clean it up, just hold it still. I took the envelope and sat down at my desk. Inside was a letter, handwritten, full of messy ink and real emotion. Fraser had been watching from afar. He'd seen the articles when my son was promoted. He heard whispers in business circles about asset movements, family transitions, legal adjustments. And he knew what they were doing, because decades ago we made a promise. If either of us ever saw the other's legacy being rewritten in his absence, we'd step in. He had kept his word, quietly, precisely, legally. Enclosed were documents, confirming that the original trust, the one I set up with Mary, had never been overwritten. Because the last amendment I made had been witnessed, filed, and protected by someone I thought had forgotten me. But he hadn't. And now, sitting in my study, holding the very proof that I still mattered, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Anchor, not anger, not vengeance, just truth, rising slowly to the surface after being buried beneath too many conversations I wasn't invited to. They had taken my silence as surrender, but they had forgotten that sometimes silence isn't giving up. It's gathering strength. It's waiting for the right name to be spoken in the first line. The night after the lawyer left, I didn't sleep. Not because I was restless, but because I finally wasn't. For the first time in weeks, the silence in the house felt like mine again. Not something forced on me, but something I chose. I sat at the same desk where I once balanced checkbooks and wrote letters to Mary when she was in the hospital. The drawer creaked like an old friend trying to speak. Inside it, order, memory, proof. I pulled out the envelope labeled "Final Copy Witnessed." It had Mary's initials in the corner. She always added them, not out of necessity, but love. "Just so no one forgets I had a say," she once told me with a smile. I stared at that envelope a long time, not because I doubted it, but because it reminded me what legacy actually is. Not money, not land, but the choices you make in the dark, when no one is watching. When there's no applause, I laid the original will on the table. Beside it, I placed the document they gave me last week, their version. It was longer, shinier, colder, Polished by lawyers who probably never lost sleep, wondering if their kids would eat. Optimized for generational wealth, stripped of heart. Mary and I had split things differently. Not equally, but fairly. We knew our children, what they needed and what they could handle. Some things were left with conditions, not punishment, but boundaries. Because love, real love, isn't blind. It sees flaws and still protects. They thought they could outright us, outplan us, undo us. But you can't overwrite a foundation. You can only pretend it's not there. Until it cracks through the floor you tried to build on top of it. The next morning I met with a lawyer again. I brought both sets of papers. But more importantly, I brought something else. A small USB stick. Nothing fancy. No password. Just truth. It contained an audio file, recorded unintentionally, or maybe fatefully, the day of the family meeting, when they left me in the kitchen, when they assumed the wall couldn't hear, when they didn't know my phone, tucked between napkins, was still recording. I hadn't meant to keep it, but I also hadn't been able to delete it, because something in me knew. One day silence would need a voice. I handed it to the lawyer without a word. He didn't ask. He just nodded. And I saw in his eyes that he understood what kind of betrayal leaves the deepest bruise. Not the ones that take your money, but the ones that take your name and try to rewrite it before you're even gone. He promised to file the will, the real one. He said we would wait, and when the time came, if they tried to contest it, we'd let their own words speak. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no rush of victory, only something deeper, something quieter, a kind of sorrow-tinged peace, because I realized they didn't just try to take what was mine, they tried to erase what Mary and I built together. And that I could never let happen. The papers were now in the right hands. The truth had found its advocate. And my silence was finally finished speaking. It was my birthday. No candles. No speech. No seat at the head of the table. Just noise, laughter that felt strangely choreographed. Glasses clinking to something, or maybe to nothing. I wasn't sure anymore. They threw a celebration, yes, but not for me. It was for the idea of me, the placeholder, the name on the mailbox they hadn't bothered to repaint, a birthday party for a father they had already archived. I sat near the sliding glass door, next to the old ficus plant Mary used to talk to when she watered it. I liked that corner. It let me look out onto the yard we built together, the same yard where we laid down the first stones, where I buried our dog with trembling hands while my kids cried into my sweater, where I taught them to ride bikes and built swing sets from leftover wood. And now they toasted without glancing in my direction. I was in the photos, of course, framed on the walls, remembered in speeches that touched on what he used to do. Past tense, always past tense. No one mentioned who paid for the wine. No one thanked the hands that carried this family through layoffs, late mortgages, and hospital nights. No one asked if I wanted a slice of cake. Instead, they smiled at each other, carefully, politely, wearing clothes I didn't recognize, in a home I no longer fit inside. And yet every nail in those walls still knew the sound of my hammer. Every pipe still whispered my name when the water ran warm in winter. I watched them from the corner, quietly. Not because I was sad, but because I had already let go. Let go of the need to be seen by people who only looked when it served them. Let go of the need for a thank you they couldn't form without choking on pride. Let go of the illusion that love, once given, is always remembered. They thought I was quiet because I was tired. They thought I smiled because I'd forgiven. But the truth was simpler. I smiled because I knew what was coming, knew what they had set in motion, and how soon it would stop. Not with shouting, not with punishment, but with truth. Firm, undeniable. Echoing back every choice they had made under the illusion of control. I didn't raise a toast, didn't make a scene. I simply stood at one point, stretched my legs, and walked past them all, unnoticed. Out the door, into the cold evening air. And as I looked up at the sky, that same sky I had prayed under 1,000 times, I felt a strange warmth, not from the stars, but from knowing something they hadn't figured out yet. This wasn't their house. This wasn't their legacy. And this wasn't their ending. It was mine, and it hadn't even started yet. The envelope arrived 3 days later, thick, heavy, stamped with official ink and quiet justice. Not flashy, not cruel, just inevitable. It rested on the hallway table for hours before anyone dared touch it. My son walked past it 3 times. My daughter glanced at it, then quickly away. No one asked. No one opened it, but they all felt it. The shift in the air, the silence they had grown comfortable in, now shifting underfoot like cracking ice. Later that evening, my nephew, the one who still called me uncle with real warmth, found me on the porch, sipping lukewarm tea. He picked up the envelope, turned it in his hands, then looked at me with something between worry and disbelief. "You're suing the family?" he asked, voice low. I met his eyes, calmly. Not angry, not triumphant, just steady. "No," I said. "I'm not suing anyone." He tilted his head, confused, and I let the words rise slowly, like truth doesn't need to rush anymore. I just stopped being quiet. He didn't respond, because he knew that it wasn't about money, or land, or even justice in the legal sense. It was about voice, and the years I spent surrendering it, one birthday at a time, one "don't worry, I'll handle it" at a time, one unspoken hurt at a time. The papers I filed weren't weapons. They were reminders. That legacy isn't something you can revise behind closed doors. That silence isn't the same as consent. And that a man who gave everything still holds one final right, to be heard. Inside the envelope was a single statement of intent, signed, witnessed, prepared, not to destroy anyone, but to restore what had been quietly stolen under the illusion of modern decisions and streamlined inheritance. They would now have to speak in front of someone who didn't share their last name, who didn't sit at our table, who wouldn't nod politely while they rearranged the past. For the first time, they'd have to explain themselves. Without me being quiet in the next room, I saw the fear begin to bloom in their eyes, not because they thought I'd win, but because they realized I was never really gone. Just waiting, just listening, just gathering the strength they mistook for weakness. And now, the summons wasn't my revenge. It was my reply. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, but in spirit. Sterile walls, polished floors, a room designed for order, not emotion. But the truth doesn't care where it lives. It only asks to be heard. They entered together, my children, wearing their best suits, their faces polished with just enough concern to seem respectable, just enough distance to seem composed. My son nodded to the bailiff as if they were old friends. My daughter smiled, that practiced, professional kind of smile that hides discomfort behind etiquette. They were confident. Why wouldn't they be? They believed the narrative they'd rehearsed. We're just helping Dad transition things. He's been overwhelmed lately. We're acting out of love. But the thing about rehearsed lines is they crumble when spoken beside something real. The judge entered, eyes sharp. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at them. He just opened the file, asked the room to begin, and suddenly the game they thought they were playing wasn't in their control anymore. My lawyer stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He simply pressed a button on a small black device. And then silence, until the voices began. Their voices. Clear, sharp, unmistakable. He won't argue. He's too tired to care. Just tell him it's a simplified version. He never reads the fine print. Dad's sentimental? Make it sound like it's what Mom would have wanted. He's old. He wants peace. Give him that, and he'll sign anything. My name, my age, my loyalty. Used like levers. Twisted into tools of manipulation. I didn't look at them as the recording played. I didn't have to. The stillness in the room told me enough. Every juror, every clerk, every person sitting on the edges of that moment felt the weight shift. What they heard wasn't a legal argument. It was a betrayal too deep to be masked by paperwork. My children, the ones I carried through colds and heartaches, who I sat beside through test nights and heartbreaks, who I gave my name, my hands, my roof, had spoken of me like an obstacle, a loose end, a formality. The silence that followed the end of the recording was not quiet. It was deafening. My daughter's hand trembled. My son clenched his jaw, that same jaw that once quivered when he fell off his bike and I picked him up. But now I would not be the one to comfort. The judge finally looked at me. His expression didn't change, but his eyes, they softened, then turned to them. And in that instant they understood. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about law. It was about truth. And the father they had underestimated, not because he was weak, but because he had chosen again and again to love quietly. They had mistaken quiet for consent, silence for simplicity, age for irrelevance. But now, the courtroom didn't hear a tired man's defense. They heard the voices of betrayal, and in doing so they saw him. Me, the father, still standing, still listening, still here. The judge didn't look away. He held my son's gaze for what felt like forever, not with anger, but with the weight of everything my son had spent months avoiding. Truth, responsibility, reflection. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so calm it silenced even the whispers in the room. You demanded silence, he said again, from the very man who once stayed up nights so you could sleep in peace, from the man who worked his back into knots so you could walk into classrooms, into job interviews, into adulthood, proud and unburdened. My son flinched ever so slightly. It wasn't the words. It was the tone, because this time it wasn't coming from me, the father he had learned to tune out. It was coming from authority he still respected. This isn't just a legal case, the judge went on. It's a moral one, and I see very clearly what has happened here. This man, your father, is not confused. He is not delusional. He is not incapable. He is inconvenient. I could feel the shift in the room. Something intangible but unmistakable. The air changed. The eyes that once looked at me with pity now held something else. Shame, for not having seen it sooner. The judge lifted a piece of paper from the file. He didn't wave it or hold it like a weapon. He simply read, "He's old. He just wants peace. Give him that, and he'll sign anything." He paused, then looked at my daughter. "You said that," he said, his voice lower now. "Did you mean it?" She didn't answer. Her throat moved, as if she were about to speak, but nothing came. The judge didn't press. He didn't need to, because this moment wasn't about punishment. It was about exposure, not of crimes, but of character, or the lack of it. He turned to me next, but not with a question, just a nod, as if to say, "You don't need to speak. You've spoken enough just by standing here." And in that nod, I felt something unlock in my chest, a breath I didn't know I had been holding, a grief that had sat on my shoulders for years, not because they had forgotten me, but because I had let them. All those times I stayed quiet, all the birthdays I didn't speak up, all the decisions I let slide for the sake of peace. It had never been peace. It had been silence. And silence, when it becomes survival, eventually rots the soul. But today, it broke. Today they were the ones speechless, and not because they chose to be, but because the room no longer belonged to them. My son finally lowered his eyes, not out of defeat, but out of realization that everything he thought he controlled, the house, the papers, the legacy, was built on a voice he never truly understood. Mine. The judge closed the folder. No fanfare, no final blow, just the truth, spoken, heard, and now echoing into every corner of their carefully constructed version of the future. We adjourned soon after, but even as people stood and shuffled out, no one really moved, because something had changed. Not legally, not yet, but in the way that mattered most. They couldn't unhear the words. They couldn't unsee the damage. They couldn't undo the silence. And I, for the first time in what felt like years, stood taller. Not because I had won, but because I had finally stopped disappearing. The next day in court felt different. The temperature in the room hadn't changed, but something else had. The tension had settled deeper, quieter, like dust after a long storm. My children entered the courtroom with slower steps. Gone were the quick glances and confident half-smiles. They avoided my gaze, not out of defiance this time, but something closer to reckoning. I sat still, hands folded, watching the moments unfold, like I was finally outside the frame of the portrait they had tried to paint. No longer the silent figure in the corner. Now I was the foundation they could no longer edit out. My lawyer stood without flourish. He was never theatrical, but that morning every movement he made felt sacred. He placed the documents on the table in front of the judge, carefully, one by one. No dramatics, just truth, presented like memory made solid. "Your Honor," he began, "this is the original will, filed and witnessed prior to the incident that brought us here, signed by both spouses, one of whom is no longer with us, and notarized by a family friend who passed away last spring." I looked at the familiar ink, Mary's delicate signature on the last page, her loops, her slant, her care, and I remembered the night we signed it. The kids were asleep. The house was quiet except for the kitchen clock. She had made tea even though it was late. We laughed about who would get what, not because we didn't care, but because we did. She left notes in the margins. Anna's piano, Mike's books, Divide the photographs fairly, not by value, but by memory. There was no strategy, no positioning, no fear, only love, woven into every clause. That was the will I recognized, not just legally, but soul deep. Then my lawyer placed the second document on the table, the one my children had created, the version they called streamlined, updated, more appropriate for today's needs. But the truth was unmistakable. The judge picked it up and examined the date. He blinked, then looked over at me. I believe this was signed while you were in recovery from your bypass surgery? I nodded slowly. Yes, I was still under sedation, in and out of clarity. There it was, in black and white. A legal document, created while I was barely conscious. It had my signature, but not my permission. It had their language, but not my voice. The courtroom sat in absolute stillness. Because now it wasn't just about legacy. It was about ethics, about trust twisted into quiet theft. My lawyer continued, his voice low. This copy was never filed properly. No witness, no medical clearance. It was persuasive paperwork, not lawful agreement. He didn't need to say what everyone was thinking. They had waited for my weakest moment, not to comfort me, but to rewrite me. I glanced at my son. He wasn't angry. He looked lost, as if he had finally reached the end of the story he was trying to control, only to realize it had never truly been his to write. My daughter's eyes filled with something that looked like grief. But it wasn't for me. It was for the mirror being held up to their choices. The judge cleared his throat. He didn't need to lecture any more. The papers did the speaking now. 2 wills. One built in love. The other in assumption. One filled with handwritten notes and memories. The other built on the false hope that the past could be overwritten in silence. And the one that stood was the one written before anyone ever thought of taking sides. I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of weariness, but reverence for Mary, for that kitchen table, for all the... After the hearing, the house no longer felt like mine, not because it had been taken, but because I had finally let go of what I had clung to for too long. The illusion that love would always be returned in the same shape it was given. They came home before me. Of course they did. They needed time to think, to regroup, to whisper behind doors the way they used to do when they were teenagers caught in a lie. But this time they weren't children, and the consequences weren't a lecture or a disappointed look over dinner. They were watching the foundation of their own story crack under the weight of truth. I walked through the door quietly. No slamming, no cold stares. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want apologies. I just wanted silence. But not the kind they gave me when they excluded me from meetings or asked me to stay quiet for peace. No, this silence was different. This was the silence of a man who had nothing left to explain, of someone who had said enough simply by standing his ground. My daughter was the first to speak. Her voice was brittle, careful. Dad, maybe we can talk, work something out. My son hovered near the hallway, his face pale, his shoulders tight. The same way he looked years ago when he crashed the car and didn't know how to tell me. Back then, I hugged him before I asked questions. But now? Now the damage wasn't to a car. It was to something far older and far more sacred. Trust. I didn't answer her. Not because I was cruel, but because I had finally understood the language they spoke. Silence. They had used it like a knife, to cut me out, to reduce my worth to a quiet nod, a signature, a seat in the corner. They used it to rewrite rooms I built, to pretend I was just a guest in my own legacy. Now I returned it, not to punish, but to translate, to show them how it feels when the one who once gave everything gives nothing. They sat around the kitchen table that night, the same table where we once played card games, planned holidays, told bedtime stories with extra voices to make the kids laugh. Now that table was filled with silence, not peace, not closeness, just the weight of what they couldn't undo. They tried small talk, tried asking if I wanted anything, if I was okay. I nodded once, sipped my tea, looked at them not with anger, but with distance. Because sometimes the deepest kind of grief isn't loud. It's the realization that the people you loved most didn't know how to love you back without needing something in return. They had spoken so much these past months about what was fair, what was efficient, what was best. And now they had no more words. They had spent their voices, and I had found mine, in silence. And so I let them sit in it. Let them feel what they had once asked of me. Let them understand what it means to be present and unseen. Because forgiveness isn't always a hug. Sometimes it's letting someone sit with the echo of what they've done. And as the clock ticked on the wall, the tea grew cold, and the house that once held so much life sat still, like a monument, not to what was lost, but to what was never truly valued until it stood up and walked away. The final day in court came with gray skies, the kind that pressed down on your shoulders, not with rain, but with memory. I arrived early, not because I was anxious, but because I wanted a moment alone, to sit in that wooden bench, breathe in the silence of the empty chamber, and remind myself that I had made it this far, not to fight, but to be heard. My lawyer sat beside me, calm as ever. He didn't ask if I was ready. He knew. This wasn't about readiness anymore. This was about arrival. The courtroom slowly filled, not with strangers, but with people who once shared my dinner table. My children walked in more slowly now, their clothes still pressed, but their posture unsure. Their steps didn't echo like they used to. The judge took his seat. No preamble, no delay. He spoke with the weight of someone who had read every page, listened to every word, and seen through every mask. The court has reviewed all documents, recordings, and witness statements. It finds that the original will, signed jointly by the deceased and Mr. Alden, remains the legally binding directive of this estate. He paused. All attempts to override or replace this will are hereby voided. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not in relief, but in reverence. For Mary, for every line she wrote, for every wish she folded into those margins. Then came the words I didn't expect to hear. The court also recommends the opening of a separate investigation into possible acts of coercion and fraud, committed during Mr. Alden's hospitalization, with intent to unlawfully transfer assets under false legal pretense. There was no outburst, no objections, only stillness, the kind that creeps in when shame has finally caught up to you. My children said nothing, not because they didn't want to, but because now their words could no longer protect them. The silence was broken by something softer, a sniffle, then a quiet sob. From the back of the courtroom, my grandson, 17, still growing into his shoulders, eyes red, fists clenched, chest trembling like a child who had seen something too dark, too soon. He stood slowly and walked toward me. The courtroom faded. There was just him and me. "I thought you were just a tired old man," he said, voice cracking. I didn't think you mattered that much anymore." It wasn't cruel. It was raw, a confession. Not from malice, but from all the things he'd been taught to believe. That youth means power. That silence means weakness. That love fades with age. I looked at him, and for a moment I saw my own son. Years ago, the same eyes, the same voice, the same need for someone to tell him what's true when the world spins too fast. "Old?" I finally replied, with no bitterness in my tone. "Old means I've lived long enough to see mistakes repeat themselves, and long enough to know how to stop them." He dropped his gaze, ashamed. "You're still learning," I said, "and that's okay. But never confuse quiet with absence, and never mistake time for irrelevance. The hands that held you when you were small, they still remember how." He nodded through tears, not an apology, but in understanding. It was the first time anyone in that room had truly seen me, not as an obstacle or a formality or a name in bold print, but as a man, still standing, still protecting, still loving, even when it hurt. The gavel fell, not with thunder, but finality. It was done. Not just the legal battle, but the reclaiming of something far more sacred, dignity. And as I stood to leave the courtroom, my steps were slower than they once were. But they were steady, because I had not walked into that room to win. I had walked in to remind them that no matter how quiet a man becomes, the truth in him never dies. 3 months passed. The days grew quieter, but not in the same way as before. It was a quieter kind of peace, the kind that arrives slowly, not with celebration, but with rest. The rest that comes after a long storm, when the ground is still wet, and the air still carries the memory of thunder. I went back to my routines. Morning walks through the garden Mary once tended. Simple meals, books I had put off reading for years. But some things never returned. No birthday cards, no phone calls, no voices over dinner asking, "Do you remember when?" The house, once overflowing with their footsteps, now echoed with absence. And yet, it didn't hurt the way I thought it would. Not anymore. Because absence is only cruel when you're still waiting. And I had stopped waiting. One morning, as I sat near the window folding old laundry, towels that still smelled faintly of summer and rain, the doorbell rang. I didn't hurry to answer it. The urgency that used to live in me had long since packed its bags. It was the courier. Neat, polite, no eye contact, just a name, a clipboard, and a small envelope. From the office of my lawyer. I closed the door gently behind me and carried it to the table, poured myself a cup of lukewarm tea, then sat and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Brief, impersonal, lawful. It read, "This letter is to confirm that all parties have formally withdrawn their claims regarding the contested estate. Furthermore, they express regret for any misunderstandings or actions that may have caused emotional strain to Mr. Alden during this process." That was it. No names, no signatures I recognized, no handwriting that trembled with remorse. Just a typed apology, without the courage to be spoken aloud. My fingers lingered on the edge of the page, not crumpling it, not folding it, just feeling the texture of what they could not say. There had been no visit, no letter with words that mattered, no knock on the door late at night with tearful eyes and trembling hands. And maybe that was what hurt most. Not what they did, but what they couldn't do after. They had tried to take everything and failed. But then they chose something worse. They chose distance, because it was easier than facing what love looks like after it's been broken. I thought of Mary, how she would have written them all anyway, how she would have sent Christmas cards no matter how they hurt her. She had a softness I've never fully had. But I'm trying. I lit a candle for her that night, placed the letter in a drawer, not to forget, but to forgive, slowly, silently in my own time. Because forgiveness isn't a letter you send. It's a decision you make each morning, to live without the weight they left behind. They didn't write. They didn't speak. They didn't say I'm sorry like I once hoped. But in their silence, I heard something else. They finally saw what they couldn't own. Not the house. Not the money. Not the man who refused to disappear. And that, in its own strange way, was enough. It is quiet today. The kind of quiet that once made me feel erased. The kind that used to echo through hallways where laughter once lived. A silence that once pressed against my chest like a weight too familiar to name. But today this silence feels different. It is not exile. It is peace. There are no footsteps on the stairs. No hurried voices arguing over who brings dessert. No nervous smiles trying to hide guilt behind small talk. The house is still, and so am I. I sit in the old armchair by the fireplace, the one Mary refused to replace even when the cushions gave in. She used to call it your throne, teasing me gently every time I sank into it with a sigh after a long day. The fire crackles beside me. It doesn't roar. It whispers, like truth, steady, patient, unafraid. I look around and see not what's missing, but what remains. The photo frames untouched. The bookshelf, heavy with stories I never got around to finishing. The shadows on the floor, stretching long with the winter sun, like memories still reaching out. And above all, I hear the only voice that matters now. My own, not the one I used in meetings, not the one I lowered in fear of conflict, but the one that comes when you've lived long enough to stop performing. The voice that says, you were never wrong for speaking gently. You were never weak for loving more than they could return. And you were never alone, just waiting for the silence to become yours again. I no longer need them to understand, or apologize, or come back. Some lessons come late, and not to those who teach them. But they come, and that is enough. I think of my grandson, his trembling voice in that courtroom, his eyes filled with the first glimpse of truth. Maybe one day he will return, not for inheritance, but for wisdom. Not for what I left behind, but for how I carried it. And if he does, I will tell him the story, not with bitterness, not to shame, but to show him what happens when a man refuses to be silenced by those who call themselves family, but forget what family really means. Because silence when forced is a wound, but silence when chosen, that is power, that is peace. I sit now not to wait, but to live, to breathe, to remember Mary's laugh echoing in this same room, to smile at the flame, the books, the warm mug in my hand. No more shouting, no more begging to be seen. No more holding my breath in rooms that forgot my name. The world in the end heard my truth, not because I screamed it, but because I let it speak through the one thing they feared most, my silence And now, in this final chapter, I know the most beautiful thing, that when they asked me to be quiet, it wasn't peace they wanted. It was permission to pretend. But truth does not ask permission. It waits. And then it walks in with steady steps and fire in its chest and says, "He never left. You just stopped listening." And now, the only voice that fills this house is mine, and it is finally enough.